Hello, honey. I love and miss you very much. I hope that this will help you go to sleep well. Tonight, I want to do a several part series about automotive safety and the evolution of it. What makes a safe car, what makes an unsafe car, and kind of how we got where we are. So, the first thing that I need to really talk about is a little glossary. Two of the big terms I'm going to talk about tonight are going to be body on frame and unibody. And those are two construction methods for, a lot of things, but we're going to focus on cars for tonight. So, body on frame is the original method of building a car. And basically, the way that is, and this is grossly simplified, there's a frame, and it's kind of nicknamed a ladder frame because that's sort of how it looks, where you've got two longitudinal rails running the length of the car with a bunch of cross members connecting side to side. And that's the spine or backbone of the car, the structural backbone, if you will. And so all of the major structural strength of the car is wrapped up in that. So basically, the frame is where the engine, transmission, axles all are attached to, and then the body, which is not integral, is bolted on top of the frame. So it's body on frame. Now, cars, examples of that are like pickup trucks, my Jeep, your car, more truck-like vehicles. Or you have unibody, which a unibody is where the body of the car is also the structural frame of the car. Examples of that are like your mom's car, my car. Most modern non-truck based vehicles are unibody. And in the early days, when we were first starting to think about automotive safety, most vehicles were body on frame. And that's good from a simplicity perspective. It's cheap and it's easy and it's relatively strong. It's not as great for safety unless there's a lot of design put into it, because the frame is typically only like 50 or 60% of the width of the car. So the frame rails from the side are like a foot and a half inboard of the side of the doors. And because it's narrow, that frame is not as wide as the car. So in like an offset collision, like where you're only, let's say 30% of the car is striking a barrier, if you're on a body on frame vehicle, it's very possible that 30% of the car, of the width of the car, may not even hit any of the frame at all. And in that case, if it misses the frame where the main structural strength is, unless it's a newer vehicle where there's actual structure in the body, you're kind of screwed. And pound for pound, unibody is actually safer than body on frame. And the reason for that is that with body on frame, unless it's something newer, all of the meaningful structural strength of the vehicle is wrapped up in the frame, which is at the bottom and doesn't extend all the way forwards and backwards and isn't as the full width of the vehicle. So there can be a lot of deformation of the vehicle, of the occupant space, before you reach the strength of the frame. So like if you get T-boned, if the frame rail is 18 inches inboard of the door, if you get T-boned, it's an older car where there's not a lot of structure there, the entire side of the car might cave in 18, 20 inches until it reaches the frame that stops the impact from going further, which is obviously bad if you're sitting at 18 to 20 inches. Now, unibody is safer for a couple of reasons. The main thing with the unibody is that because the body is the frame and it carries all the stresses, the body is significantly stronger. The other thing is that with body on frame, with the frame being at the bottom, there's a lot less potential directions you can direct the force of an accident and the energy. With unibody, where the roof rails, the sills under the doors themselves, the pillars, where everything is structural, it's easier to make everything tie together into one very rigid, very strong occupant safety cell that's significantly stiffer, significantly stronger, more resistant to deformation. Because there's two things when it comes to the structure, two structural goals of an accident. For one thing, you want the external structure to absorb as much of the force of the energy of the accident as possible. So that means that when you have crumple zones, you want the longest possible crumple zone to absorb the most amount of energy from the accident. The second goal is you want the occupant cabin to remain intact. And those two things are important because if you have no crumple zone, if the car isn't absorbing the energy, the people inside are. So even if the interior is not damaged, if the people inside get slammed from 50 to 0 in 6 inches, that's probably going to kill you. The other thing is that even if the deceleration, the impulse from the crash is relatively low, but the cabin crumpled up into the back seat, you're probably not going to be around either if you're now wearing the engine instead of your pants. So you want the exterior structure, to absorb every bit of energy possible to avoid passing it to the occupants. And you want the safety compartment, the passenger compartment, to maintain its structure in all conditions. Now, the reason unibodies are better, like I said, at this pound for pound, is because the body is the frame of the vehicle. So, like, if you look at a unibody vehicle, under the door sills, there's a long rail that's fairly far outboard that runs forward to back on the car. That carries the structural forces of the chassis, and that's right next to the door, right under it. Same thing with the roof rail. The roof rail carries the structural load of the vehicle. The roof rail is an important part of the passenger compartment. The door pillar that prevents intrusion, because you have the roof and the door sill that are very strong structural components, you can attach a very strong very strong pillar to that, and that's going to resist intrusion from the side. There's also crosswise beams multiple places in the roof and under the floor, so left to right, as well as like right in front of the dash. There's a huge piece that crosses over left to right, and right behind the back seats there's a big piece that crosses over left to right. That way that if you get T-boned, the doors have door beams in them to resist intrusion. The B pillar will resist intrusion. The roof, because it's braced from left to right, and the floor, because it's braced from left to right, will all distribute those forces and hold the shape of the cabin relatively well. And even if the doors can't open, if you don't get crushed, you still won, because you can survive that. Now, body on frame is tough because with the majority of the structural strength of the vehicle wrapped up in the frame, if you miss that frame, like a side impact or a glancing blow from the front or back, that leaves a lot of potential for the structure of the vehicle to deform. Now, newer vehicles are much better than older ones because now that we do crash testing and stuff, we recognize that, and so changes have been made, but the fact still remains that pound for pound, a unibody is better absorbing the energy because the structures that would absorb the energy anyways are already structural, so they're already very strong to begin with. Plus, like I said, you're not having to pound for pound. You don't have to account for a several hundred pound just frame that's essentially just dead weight in a unibody because it's not there. The other thing with unibodies is that because everything is one rigid piece, this doesn't happen often, but it's very dangerous. And when it does occur with a body on frame vehicle, is if you get body and frame separation, that's really, really bad. You're not going to get that on a unibody because it's all one coherent piece. Where with a body on frame vehicle, if you take a hit the right way, sometimes it'll rip the body right off the frame, and then you're really screwed when that happens. That's really, really no bueno. Now, some other things that we've done that have really improved car safety, in addition to just making the occupant cabin keep its space, like I said, crumple zones I was just talking about a minute ago. Those are very important. And the way that they do that is that on a body-on-frame vehicle, the frame rails will have a section of the frame rail that's maybe dimpled is the wrong term, but it's not dimpled, but it's what is the correct word for that? Maybe it's crinkled, pre-crinkled, where it's built into the metal, and it's maybe an 18 to 24 inch crinkled section of the frame that's still very strong. But if you get into a bad accident, the frame is designed to collapse right there. And if it collapses 18 or 24 inches, that will absorb the force of the energy, some of the force of the collision. And then behind that, you have the rest of the frame, which is still not designed to bend, so that'll support the main passenger cabin, keep it from crumpling. Unibody vehicles are sort of the same way, but a little different, where you have a unibody rail, And under the passenger compartment, the unibody rail is ultra high strength steel or boron steel, some kind of very, very high strength material, where in front of the passenger compartment, it's the same way. It's got indentations that are designed to that are designed to make it fold in a certain manner. And it's also made of a lower strength material, which seems bad, but like I said, the goal is if you can crumple the outside as much as possible, but have the inside maintain its shape, everybody gets the best chance of walking away. So you've got the crumple zone that's designed to allow controlled collapse of the chassis. And then you've got the passenger compartment that's built of ultra high strength steel. And it's got, like I said, from a side impact perspective, you've got multiple crosswise beams that distribute force across the sides. You've got the roof rail, the A pillar and the roof rails, and the underdoor sills are longitudinal members. Those are tied together in multiple places with high strength steel beams. The doors themselves are actually a really, really important part of the passenger cell, because the doors, like I said, they have the side impact bars in them. They have the side impact bars in them, which not only protect you from the side, but also in a forward impact, the doors have very, very strong latches, and they're attached directly into the very strong pillar structure. So the doors actually provide resistance to collapse in both the sideways and front to back directions. And then, like I said, you've also got the big crosswise beams behind the dash and the back seat. Those keep the sides from collapsing. The windshield is glued in place with a very, very strong glue. And because of the type of glass it is, the windshield is actually a very important structural element. So there's a lot of ways that they keep the passenger cabin intact. Some other cool things that this is not necessarily newer cars, but since we've been designing for safety that we do, engines are designed with breakaway mounts, because it used to be in older cars in a really bad accident, the engine would wind up coming into the passenger compartment. You wouldn't literally wind up in your lap, but the whole engine and dash and everything would get pushed backwards, and so that would wind up where the people used to be. Obviously not sweet. So on modern cars, Subarus especially, with their boxer flat engines, the engine is on breakaway mount, so if you get into a bad accident, the engine will actually get shoved under the passenger compartment instead of into it. The suspension mounts are designed to break away, so because basically everything that breaks, as long as not in the passenger compartment, is absorbing more energy. Not to mention that, like, if you get let's say you get clipped, 20% offset head on by somebody in the oncoming direction. One of the other things that older cars were really bad about was the toe pan where your feet are was relatively weak. And because there were no breakaway suspension mounts, the wheel would get shoved where your feet used to be. And that's obviously not sweet for your, continued existence as a functioning human being. So newer cars, they have breakaway suspension mountings, so that in an impact like that, the wheel will get turned sideways or just straight up flung out instead of getting pushed straight back and crushing your legs and feet. Some cars, and this is a more difficult part to do properly, some cars also have the alloy of the wheels is designed to shatter in a crash scenario. That's difficult because it's hard to find a good balance between the wheel braking and not being shoved into your feet in a crash, and the wheel braking on the street, because you don't want that to happen. So breakaway engines, breakaway suspension mounts. Volvo, for instance, this is where, again, Volvo goes above and beyond. The A-pillar goes all the way from forward of the front doors all the way to the back of the vehicle is one solid piece of steel. It's not made of multiple sections, and nobody else is really doing that. So pound for pound, a unibody vehicle is safer than a body-on-frame vehicle when it comes to getting in a crash, because the unibody is softer where it needs to be softer, harder where it needs to be harder, and because it has more areas to dissipate the energy, it can dissipate the energy across a wider part of the vehicle, which means you experience less forces. Another area that's less widely talked about, but I wish that it wasn't, is a smaller vehicle is more able to avoid the collision to begin with or lessen the severity of the accident. And I think that that's something that I wish people would understand more about is, the best accident is one you don't get in at all. And because a unibody vehicle is a more rigid, lighter structure than a body on frame vehicle, it can handle, it typically has a lower center of gravity. It handles better. It brakes better. So you're more likely to be able to completely avoid an accident by swerving around it. Or because it brakes better, you might be able to completely brake your way out, completely stop for an accident. Or at the very least, because it brakes better, you might be able to get into an accident at a slower speed. So I think there's something to be said for that, but nobody really talks about that when it comes to safety features. Some other interesting areas that we've changed. In older cars, the steering column, what the steering wheel turns to turn the front wheels, was a solid rod that went down to the steering box in the front axle. And typically that was in front of the front axle. So what would happen if you got into a bad accident was older cars will fold up in a bad accident, just not in a controlled way like newer ones do. What would happen if you got into a bad accident was as the front axle got shoved backwards and the front of the car smashed in, that solid rod of a steering column would get shoved backwards and hit the driver in the chest or the face, usually with fatal consequences, which was not cool. Modern cars, we have multiple ways that doesn't happen anymore. For one thing, the steering box is usually behind the front axle now, so it's a little bit more protected from that. Also, modern cars have collapsible steering columns, where rather than having a straight rod that drives the steering wheel, that if you get in an accident, it's going to get shoved backwards into your face. Nowadays, the steering column is actually collapsible to like 12 to 18 inches. So if you get in an accident and the entire front end of the car gets crushed in, the steering column will actually collapse rather than just get shoved backwards like a spear into your face. And also, even if you do happen to hit the airbag on the wheel will keep your face from getting broken. Let's see. Some other things that I think about that not many people do. This is part of the reason why I like Subaru and Volvo. Is most manufacturers really only test to what the government, or there's another agency called the IIHS. They're a independent nonprofit run by the insurance companies, and their goal is to reduce claim costs. But they run a very, very comprehensive crash testing program, far and above what the government does. The IIHS in the 90s really got their voice because they started publishing Dateline. If you remember that show, Dateline reports basically detailing how bad that a lot of cars were doing in crash tests. And so most manufacturers really only design cars to what the IIHS or the government are doing, and mainly the government. They don't really do anything about the IIHS until the IIHS tests one of their models and says, yeah, this sucks, and puts it on blast. Anyways, my point being about that, most manufacturers that they don't make safety their number one thing, their number one selling point, like Subaru and Volvo do. They make cars to pass the government crash test, which is a good thing, and the IIHS crash test now, which is a good thing. They're pretty safe real world, and the IIHS tests specifically are pretty reflective of what happens in the real world. But they don't really put that effort in other places where people aren't testing it. So like the thing I showed you a couple weeks ago where it was crashing an object into the roof of a Toyota and a Volvo, nobody's ever going to test for that scenario. But Volvo, because they know in the real world you might get hit by something there, they made that structure significantly stronger, where other manufacturers don't. Same thing goes for rear impact. For some reason that I can't figure out why this is, nobody crash tests for rear impact, at least not instrumented with dummies. The only rear impact crash test I'm aware of in the U.S. is an uninstrumented, so there's no dummies instrumented. They don't take any measurements of interior compartment intrusion. Government crash test, all they do is try to test for fuel leaks in the event of a rear end accident, but they're not measuring to make sure that the cabin holds its shape, or the forces on the dummies. They're only measuring to make sure that there's not a fuel leak. I don't really know why nobody crash tests for that, because rear end crashes are the most common type of crashes in the U.S. But again, if you take, you can't really see the structural aspects of a car. They're under the skin. But if you look at like a Subaru or a Volvo under the skin compared to most other brands of cars, you're going to find a lot more steel, a lot more structure in places that government crash tests and IHS crash tests don't necessarily reflect. Like I said, I think that's because Subaru and Volvo, because they specifically target their brand for safety, that's why that is you're not just buying something that passed a crash test there. You're buying from a manufacturer whose basically their entire thing is how safe their car is. So I think that that's part of why I like those cars so much. They kind of go above and beyond, and Volvo has some really interesting ideas. Nobody else is doing this, but Volvo has the side impact protection system. And most cars, the side impact protection consists solely of a strong enough structure to keep you from, getting hit in the face by the car T-boning you. Obviously, seatbelts and airbags to keep you from hitting your head on anything. Volvo has done, now that's good because it keeps you from, like I said, it keeps you from wearing the other vehicle's hood as a shirt, which is a good thing. But Volvo's taken it a step further with their side impact protection system. And what Volvo has done that's really interesting is that the center consoles between the seats are designed to crush, and there's about an 8-inch space. So basically, if you were to look under the vehicle, the side-to-side beams on the bottom don't extend all the way to the sides. The main side rail that absorbs the energy is about 8 inches away from the meaningful structure under the bottom. And that initially sounds bad, but the roof structure is exactly as strong as it should be. And it's got the crosswise beams going the full width, so the roof stays intact in a side impact, so the upper part of the doors and the roof doesn't fold inwards. But the lower part is actually on each side about 8 inches short of the bottom of the doors. And what they've done is the B pillar, so the pillar between the front and rear doors, is designed to fold in such a way that it allows if you get in a side impact, it allows the bottom structure, the bottom sill with the bottom of the doors, to crush in about 8 inches before it gets stopped. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's essentially a crumple zone for the side of the vehicle. Because most other vehicles, their only defense is just keeping the impact from hitting you directly. But you may not get hit physically by the vehicle, but you're still going to experience all the force because there's no meaningful crumple zone there. But on the Volvos with their side impact protection system, it's actually a side crumple zone. And the way they do it, like I said, is they have about 6 or 8 inches of controlled crumple space on the sides, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually counts for a lot. And that'll allow the lower door sill and the lower part of the doors to hinge inwards about 6 to 8 inches. And the consoles between the seats are designed to be crushed or displaced, so the seats can be pushed together a little bit. But there's very strong beams past that 6 or 8 inches of designed intrusion, so that the intrusion doesn't go further than 6 or 8 inches. It's not a structural weakness, it's a design feature. And like I said, that's actually a side crumple zone, so that absorbs some of the force of the collision more so than a completely rigid system would, which is really interesting because I don't think anybody else is doing stuff like that. And that's another area where Volvo has gone kind of above and beyond. And in the real world, that'll protect you even better, because not only are you not going to get hit in the face by the car T-boning you, but you're also going to be much less likely to have whiplash because you've got that side crumple zone that's absorbing some of that energy. Let's see, what else is there as far as structure? One of the other things, and this is where I think that there's a big potential for safety improvement in the U.S. One of the most important things when it comes to multi-vehicle car crashes, not just a car hitting like a tree, but car-to-car crashes, is bumper compatibility. Because the plastic bumper that everybody calls a bumper is not actually technically the bumper. The bumper bar is behind that, and that's the actual crash member that's designed to distribute the force of a collision into the chassis of the car where it can be absorbed properly. One of the problems is that while all passenger cars are designed to have compatible bumper heights where the structure of the bumpers is designed to be at a height that overlaps. So if you crash a Ford Focus into a Volkswagen Jetta, those two cars, the bumpers are going to line up, and that means that both cars are going to be hit right where they're structurally strongest and provide the best ability to protect their occupants. The problem is that trucks and SUVs are exempt from that regulation. So that means that trucks and SUVs don't have to have bumpers that line up with the impact structure of a car, which means that if you're hitting a car, you're likely to do more, not only likely to do more cosmetic damage because the bumper height mismatches, but also some trucks and SUVs, not a ton of them, but some of them, the bumper heights are so high that it rides right over the members designed to activate the crumple zones on small cars, which obviously you can't beat physics. If a 6,000-pound vehicle hits a 3,000-pound one, the people in the 3,000-pound vehicle are going to have a worse day than the people in the 6,000-pound vehicle. But if the vehicles have bumpers that line up and both crumple zones are activated properly, that means both vehicles are giving their occupants the best possible chance to walk away. Where if you have one that the impact structure overrides the other's impact structure and hits the more vulnerable part of its structure where there's less structure to keep the other vehicle out, that even though obviously you can't beat the physics mismatch of the weights, that kind of defeats the purpose of having crumple zones and whatever, and it really hurts the chances of the people in the other vehicle getting to walk away. So that's where I wish that in the U.S. they would update the regulations to where all vehicles have to have bumpers within a certain height range, that way that they're all compatible in a crash. Because if you have one vehicle overriding the other one, that's pretty no bueno. But that's going to be it for this episode. And the next one, I'm going to cover some more stuff. Love you. Sleep well.